Hello everyone, my name is Kristen McPhee and I'm introducing my case study. So my client is a 48-year-old Caucasian female that's 5'1" and 120 pounds. She has a history of gestational diabetes with 4 of her 5 pregnancies, as well as fibrocystic breasts that were found during her routine mammograms. And she was diagnosed with breast cancer about a year ago. It was an caught very early, and she elected to have a bilateral mastectomy. Her mother is alive and healthy. Her father died in his late 50s of congestive heart failure and also had hypertension and type 2 diabetes. One of her grandmothers had breast cancer and one of her grandfathers had diabetes. She did test negative for the genetic predisposition for breast cancer. Her diet is mostly organic foods that are prepared from the home. She likes a variety of foods and isn't afraid to try new things. She avoids dairy, she avoids soy except tempeh, refined carbohydrates, and she considered herself during the initial consult 95% vegan, and she also stated that she avoids all carbohydrates. She does consume a lot of vegetables, or about 5 servings a day, which is fairly good. And the breakdown from her macronutrients was from her food log and chronometer, so her protein intake was a little high, but she was actually slightly low in all of her amino acids. Her carbohydrates are more than double, and I found that she was consuming some whole grains. Her fat intake was slightly low and consisted mostly of omega-6s. And her micronutrient profile looked really great, and there were no deficiencies there. She practices yoga daily from her home, and she also does farm work. And her physical exam looked really great. Her laboratory data showed that she had elevated glucose and HGB, elevated folate, as well as elevated MCV and MCH, and that her red blood cell count was low. And she is taking a fair amount of supplements. They're all of good quality. She is taking a multivitamin and B complex, and when combined, they are doubling her folate by 2 times the recommended daily allowance, which may explain why her folate was high. And my assessment was that her history of gestational diabetes and elevated fasting glucose suggests that the diet has a high glycemic load, particularly from carbohydrates, fruit, and dried fruit. And her mostly vegetarian/vegan diet suggests an insufficiency in B12 foods. And my diagnoses are quite similar. So excessive carbohydrate intake is related to consumption of grains, dried fruit, and fruit with insufficient protein and fats, as evidenced by her blood work, as well as history of gestational diabetes. And insufficient B12 intake is related to insufficient intake of animal-derived foods, as well as potential low gut bacteria and probiotic intake, as evidenced by her blood work and her tongue assessment. So my short-term goals were to focus on adding in and allowing some flexibility, because I know that she's creative in the kitchen. So I aim to have her include an omega-3 source at every meal and introduce blood sugar balancing medicinal foods, as well as a plant-based protein powder to ensure she was meeting all of her amino acid intake. And my biggest challenge was probably just with assessing her laboratory data correctly. So I learned that serum, B12, and folate are not always the most accurate ways to test for those two, and that supplementation can affect those at the serum level and not the cellular level. So there's more accurate ways to test those. And that an optimal B12 range is still higher than what hers is stating, even though she is within the range. So I elected to replace her B complex with just a B12 methylated supplement to balance her B12 and folate levels out. Other than that, my other challenge would probably be just understanding her story of her food intake during the initial consult versus looking at her actual food diary and comparing those two to make an accurate assessment of what's really going on. Okay, thank you for your time. Talk to you later. Bye.